Just to begin, I'd like to acknowledge the first Australians on whose land we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm going to keep the introductions quite short so we can get actually into the substance of the conversation. Well, my name is Damien Clifford, just for the purpose of the video, because I think everyone might know my name at this stage from the previous iterations. So we have the great pleasure of welcoming Benota Moy Damai to give the presentation today. Benota is a member of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of the Human Rights Council. He's been appointed to that in 2020, and he'll be on that. He has that membership for 3 years. But he's also a PhD candidate at RegNet. And then, in addition to that, we also have an honorary professor, Kevin Heller, who's going to act as the discussant for this presentation. So it's going to, Kevin, in addition to being an honorary professor here, is also a professor of international law and security at the University of Copenhagen. So the format is the same as always. Benota is going to present for 20 to 25 minutes, and then Kevin is going to give some of his thoughts, hopefully, and facilitate the conversation for us. So, thanks very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional custodians, elders, past and present of this land. I'd like to share today about the work of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, the research and studies that we do for the promotion and protection of the indigenous peoples' rights and their empowerment. The expert mechanism is a subsidiary body of the Human Rights Council. This mandate is to advise the Human Rights Council on the human rights of indigenous peoples and assist states and indigenous peoples in meeting the aims of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So before going to details, I'd like to share very briefly what is EMRIP and why UNDRIP or the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are important for indigenous peoples. How to move it? Okay. That's my outline to the presentation. So when I say about the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, it is though created 2007, but it has a long journey in the UN system. So 1982, when established the Working Group of Indigenous Populations, which is based on the recommendations by Jose Martinez-Cobo's study on the discrimination against indigenous peoples at the UN. So this journey, the establishment of the Working Group of Indigenous Peoples, started discussing about having the indigenous peoples' human rights in the UN mechanisms. So then the Working Group of Indigenous Peoples facilitated inviting the indigenous leaders for having the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And before that, what I'd like to share also the brief background about the EMRIP, why a Working Group of Indigenous Populations turned into as an EMRIP. So when it was started in 1982 as a Working Group of Indigenous Populations, then it was under the Commission on Human Rights and its subsidiary body, the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of the Minorities. So Working Group of Indigenous Populations was the very lowest level at the UN system at that time, and also didn't have the capacity to deal with the indigenous people issues. So therefore, when the Commission on Human Rights transformed as the Human Rights Council in 2006, then the institutional buildings process discussed about transforming the Working Group of Indigenous Peoples as one of the indigenous peoples expert mechanisms body in the UN system. So indigenous peoples that had a declaration that has the indigenous people leaders, they have lobbied with the UN member states, and also at the same time they drafted the proposal what should be the replacement, the best replacement for the working group of indigenous peoples in the UN systems. And therefore, the final outcome has come as an expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples in 2007, and through the regulations of the UN Human Rights Council 6/36. So now I'd like to touch a little bit about the UN DRIP, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because there's the key mandated areas of the UN expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. So the UN DRIP, as I mentioned, that it has started drafting in 1985 under the Working Group of Indigenous Populations, and in 1993 the draft finalized and submitted to the subcommission to the human rights on minorities, and then this draft declaration to have as a declaration, then it's a Commission on Human Rights established a working group to discuss on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it has, in 2006, the Commission on Human Rights, when it turns to as a Human Rights Council, by the time it has completed the drafting, and in June 2006, the UN declarations was adopted by the Human Rights Council and referred to the UN General Assembly for final adoption. So in 2007, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the UN General Assembly. And the UN Declaration contains 24 preambles and 46 operative paragraphs. And those key provisions are in this UN Declaration is the most important part is the self-determination, autonomy, participation, free, fair, informed consent, land, territory, and resource rights, and also language, education, and cultural rights. Also, other thing is that it has incorporated in line with this UN Charter, that if we see the UN Charter itself starts by saying that we the peoples determine. But if we see the history of indigenous peoples, when it's the peoples or whatever, the equality, indigenous peoples have been always considered as or excluded in this enjoying their human rights. So because of the indigenous peoples, their position, historical positions and vulnerability, in line with the UN Charter, that's why there's the proposals, these non-discriminations and fundamental human rights should be also required for the indigenous peoples. That's why if we see the articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, there is nothing new that comes from outside. It is all about the other. It already exists to other international human rights instruments that's just separated for indigenous peoples and incorporated with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there is nothing new human rights framework that applies for indigenous peoples. It's all about just compilation from different international human rights instruments. So there's the UN DRIP. Sorry, I think, no. How it goes? Okay, thanks. So now I'm moving to the mandate that when initiated the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. So when it first established 2007 in December, it was in a very limited form. It was just an advisory body, advisory functions, and assist the implementations what the Human Rights Council mandated us. This is basically whatever they want. They just propose the regulation in a study. It doesn't have anything related with that indigenous people's aspects. So there is nothing clear guidelines in the beginning. But the positive side is that the UN system at least recognized having a body under the Human Rights Council as a subsidiary body to deal with the indigenous people issues. So because of that, in 2014, when the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples occurred, conducted by the UN General Assembly, the indigenous leaders proposed to review the mandate of the Human Rights Council and to propose the mandate to review the mandate of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. Based on the 2014 discussion, so Human Rights Council in 2016 passed the resolutions to by providing a very detailed mandate on the for the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people. So the mandate is now very clear. It is that the one is to work for achieving the goals and aims of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it has several levels of works. One is the country engagement. The country engagement is to assist the the country engagement is providing the technical advice to the member states where law, policy, developments are required. And also the dialogue facilitation is with the indigenous peoples, member states, and the UN agencies and other international stakeholders. And the other one is also to facilitate for achieving the UN declarations if there is anything left out. So this is through the country missions of the EMRIP, which is in the previous mandate was not there. The other thing is the most important part here, based on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to conduct studies, research studies, and prepare report. So all these studies is interrelated to the UN Declaration provisions. Like for so the study is through the research base and also report produced in relation to that. To produce the good practices and the challenges, and also to address to the government or recommending to the member states to promoting indigenous people's human rights. And there is also this is also the advice to the Human Rights Council, and this is also related to the other UN mechanisms recommendations on the indigenous people issues. For example, the recommendations coming from the UN treaty monitoring bodies, the recommendation coming from the UN special procedures, all other UN mechanisms that all produce recommendations for indigenous peoples. So this is also how EMRIP combined and also proposed as a proposal to the Human Rights Council, advising that why those recommendations are important and why it is what are the levels of implementation. So the current compositions of the members, we have 7 members from different regions, so from 7 socioeconomic regions. We have our own indigenous peoples proposed socioeconomic regions. So the 7 members are myself from the Asia, Professor Megan Davis from Pacific, and Balkasem, he is from Algeria, from Africa. Erika is from Latin America. Professor Christian Carpenter from Colorado University in USA, and Laila Susan, she is the current chair at Sami from Norway, and Rodion, he is from Russia, he is representing Russia and Caucasus region. So this is just slightly see the term when our terms are expiring. We will be replaced, mine is in 2023, Megan Davis 2022 next year, and 2021, 2 of our colleagues are ending soon this year. So just an example for the country engagement, as I mentioned, one of the mandate. So it's actually too early to assess how best we are doing in terms of promoting the UN rights at the country level. But when the member states and the indigenous people organizations invite us for the engagement to give suggestions on the promotions and the protection of the indigenous people's rights through the legal and policy development. So we accept, we receive this, and when the country visits, we do consultation. So very after the mandate review from 2016, so we had 4 country visits directly and 5 at the last, and still now there are a few requests like Japan and Democratic Republic Congo, but we cannot accommodate all this because of this COVID-19. But the positive side is that when we have this dialogue at the national level, we try to bridge the gap between indigenous peoples and the member states, as well as if there is other stakeholders, so that all are in a one platform that can talk about those issues or the challenges or the implementation process. So we had Finland in 2018, Mexico 2018, New Zealand 2019, and Yaqui people and Sweden. This is ongoing. Ongoing means what I said, that when we had this country mission, then we actually also had the conversation about returning these ceremonial objects. Like, for example, there are Yaqui peoples, their ceremonial objects are taken by the Sweden museums, and the Yaqui people from Mexico want to get back, and that's why they are looking for assistance from EMRIP to facilitate. So that's how we do. That's how we are working there. And the studies and reports, since its inception in 2008, we have done a few. I could not tell you very details, but the methodology for each of research studies and the reports is basically collecting the data from the indigenous peoples organizations and also from other stakeholders, UN agencies, and also conducting expert seminars, regional seminars in various levels at the UN and also with the geographical regions where indigenous peoples are located. So based on that, we prepare the studies, research studies and reports, and then we identify the challenges, good practices and recommendations, how we can further improve the situation on those particular fields. So now we are conducting at this moment one study of the indigenous child. And also at the same time, we are preparing a report on the self-determination rights, how this has been practiced towards indigenous peoples' land and territory. So this basically like internal self-determination. It is not about something like succession. So this is based on in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we also understand that self-determination is the overarching rights for indigenous peoples. So we organize the annual sessions here, and what we usually do during the annual session, this is just a brief outlines and also how we handle the situation. Because if it comes the annual session, indigenous peoples comes with a lot of complaints about the human rights violations on the ground. As we are only mandated to look after the UN DRIP and how it's promoted and identify the challenges. That's why we don't deal these allegation things in our EMRIP body, but we refer these allegation issues to discuss with the UN special procedures, with the special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. This is one of the session participants. So Human Rights Council session, we, as I mentioned, according to the mandate, we prepare the report and we submit to the Human Rights Council. We address every September in the Human Rights Council sessions. We present our report and we try to get approval our future studies, research studies and proposal. And we also have this coordination mechanisms among the UN systems. So UN have like four UN mechanisms that deal with the indigenous people issues. So this is the important part in terms of the collaboration in the global governance structure on indigenous peoples. So we have the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, whose mandate is to support indigenous delegates to participate. And a permanent forum who deals with the 5 particular areas under the ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council. These are the human rights, environment, social economic developments, culture and education. And the UN Special Report on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who particularly deal the human rights situation, alleges, and also these life threat matters for indigenous peoples. And EMRIP, we do these research studies and advice to the government. And we also do other activities with other UN agencies. For example, now we are advising to the UNESCO how best we can deal with the indigenous language revitalizations within this decade time. And also we do advise international labor organizations about the implementation of the ILO Convention 169 on indigenous and tribal peoples. So that's what very briefly I want to share, like how we see these EMRIP positions in a global governance system, how we are working for the indigenous peoples at the local level, at the international level, and how we see this improvement, also the partnership with the academic institutions for the research and all this. Over the years, since the mandate review, we had this expert seminar with different universities, like University of Colorado and British Columbia, University of British Columbia, Manitoba University, University of Greenland, and University of Chiang Mai. So there's the option that we also see how we do more deep research collaboration, the research collaboration on the indigenous people issues. And also, of course, the important part is the monitoring, the UNDRIP that we always put on the top, even in the international dialogues and negotiation. So it's the summary of my presentations. This is how EMRIP work, in terms of the promotional work of the UNDRIP, how we work for the good practices, and also how we provide understanding the declarations, and also the opportunity to engage with the human rights bodies, including Human Rights Council, coordination with the UN mechanisms, and also among indigenous peoples and others, like in the UPR, special procedures, other process. So this is one of the partition pictures of the Indigenous Fellows 2019 in the EMRIP session. So this is my last slide of the presentation. You may expect that because there's a research seminar could be more deeply discussing about the research issue. But the point is that for the EMRIP, our research, as I mentioned, the methodology and the research we do have already, I can share every single report details, the research finding. Definitely there are some good examples where indigenous peoples enjoy the self-determination rights, whether their land and territory, they are under their own governance systems, where indigenous peoples still have their traditional customary rights under the governance structure. They have been doing much better than the other regions where indigenous peoples have still lack of recognitions, whether indigenous peoples every day face injustice, discriminations, whether indigenous peoples always face the gross and systematic human rights violations, where indigenous peoples also face this assimilation policy, ethnic cleansing policy, where indigenous people face also this because of the population transfer to their territory, their culture and identity, the threats. So all these elements are actually in our research, in our as a good practice and challenges that member states always put us. So how the international governing system also helping us as indigenous peoples to respect or to protect the rights. So all these are actually in our reports, which I cannot share very details here at this moment. So I will encourage, if you have more interest, please visit our website, the EMRIP website. You can see further, you can find there all these research findings. And also because of my background, I like to explore a little bit. Myself, my background is an activist. I have just started my PhD here 2018 with the Regulation and Governance, School of Regulation and Global Governance. My research focus about the peace, settlement, and human rights of indigenous peoples. I am looking into how the power sharing actually work for indigenous peoples to protect their rights, to promote their human rights, and how this power in the post-conflict areas, peace settlement really promote indigenous people's human rights as well. So there's my research, which I am still doing. So that's my part, and this one is EMRIP is because of my previous engagements. More than 20 years now, I have been engaged with this indigenous peoples movement. Started from my homeland, then contributed at the Asia regional level, and then now at the UN system trying to bridge the indigenous people issues through my activism. As a research or academic, thought wasn't my background, so I cannot really reflect you through the academic lens here. But what we have been doing is actually collaborative activities as an EMRIP with the academic institutions. So last 4 years, our work is practically with the academic institutions, doing more research, more analytical, more systematic. So I thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm happy to share if you have any questions.